We are here, in this space where time gathers dust and prayers disintegrate into silence. My work, my enduring compulsion, is not to chase shadows, but to document the moments when the foundation of the world shifts, ever so slightly, beneath our feet. I am the custodian of forgotten stories, the chronicler of the acoustic remnants of injustice. And sometimes, those remnants are heavy. They are bound in leather and scented with a century of neglect. The discovery was made in 1993, though the events it detailed had concluded decades earlier. It was late autumn in Chicago, the kind of evening where the air itself seems pressed and brittle, promising the bitter winter ahead. I had gained access, through channels that prefer discretion, to a decommissioned chapel just west of the Loop.
Midnight Hauntings.
A structure abandoned since the early 70s, earmarked finally for commercial demolition. It was not a grand cathedral. It was squat, built of hard, functional brick, an architectural product of the post-Great Fire reconstruction. Solid, perhaps, but certainly not ornate. It was built to last, not necessarily to inspire. I wasn't looking for relics or stained glass. I was looking for the archives, for the operational records, for anything that survived the bureaucratic culling when the diocese decided the silence of the space was more profitable than its maintenance. The attic was predictable, a tomb of yellowed inventory lists, moth-eaten vestments folded neatly by hands long gone, and the heavy, pervasive smell of dry rot and coal dust. The air moved reluctantly, disturbed only by the sudden shaft of my utility light, which illuminated microscopic constellations of dancing motes. I spent hours in that space, methodical, investigative, not scanning for spectral anomalies, but examining the material reality of neglect. And then I found it. Beneath a collapsed shelf of unused communion wafers and old architectural drawings that detailed the original, highly unusual configuration of the foundation. It was not stored, it was concealed, tucked deep into a wooden crate lined with lead sheeting, intended perhaps to keep the dampness out, or perhaps to keep something in. I lifted the volume. The weight was immediate, settling into the palm of my hand like a small, dense stone. Not just the weight of the paper and the marbleized pasteboard cover, but the psychological mass of 100 years compressed and sealed away. The scent was arresting, not simply mold and dust. Beneath the decay, there was a specific metallic trace, a cold, faintly coppery aroma that lingered on the skin long after I set the book down. The scent of old, cheap ink and something indefinably industrial. Something that smelled like the deep, buried plumbing of a great, dying city. The spine was broken, tied crudely with brown twine. It was a ledger, originally intended for tracking expenses or inventory, repurposed by its owner. The date inscribed on the opening page, 1923. The handwriting was precise, almost painfully meticulous, using that dense, industrial-grade black ink common to accounting firms of the era. The owner signed simply, J.W. Custodian, caretaker, the man who was responsible for the structure, the electricity, and the quiet dignity of the place. J.W., this was his chronicle, not a spiritual treatise, not a book of sermons, but the detailed, mundane diary of a worker caught between the expectations of the sacred and the inescapable demands of the city's secular reality. I turned the brittle pages with surgical care, the sound of the old paper protesting the light and movement. I skipped past the endless records of broken steam pipes and requisition forms for furnace oil, drawn forward by a dreadful, slow curiosity to the final entry. The terminus. The last desperate thought J.W. had committed to paper before he too disappeared into the structural silence of Chicago. It was written in a hand that had abandoned precision. The words were large, scrawled sideways across the page, the penmanship betraying a final, profound exhaustion. I read it slowly, allowing the weight of the phrase to settle into the cold, copper-scented air of the attic. J.W. wrote, "They do not care for the structure. They only care for the silence." It is a statement that makes no immediate sense within the context of church maintenance. Why would the silence be more important than the integrity of the building itself? This diary, this physical archive, was immediately recognized as more than a journal of personal despair. It was the material proof of a system designed to ignore, to suppress, and ultimately, to consume the inconvenient truth. J.W. was not simply troubled by ghosts, He was terrified by facts. The terror, as we shall see, was architectural. It was designed into the very fabric of the building he was paid to maintain. To understand J.W.'s final, chilling observation that the priority was silence, we must first contextualize the world that surrounded that small, sturdy chapel in 1923. Chicago, at that moment, was not merely a place. It was a pressurized, living entity, constructed atop layers of ambitious corruption and historical trauma. The city was vibrating with dissonant frequencies. The rumbling of elevated trains, the low, steady thrum of illegal activity flourishing under the shadow of prohibition, and the civic deceit that permeated every layer of public infrastructure. J.W. was a witness, not to celestial miracles, but to the cold, undeniable truth that often buildings are not built for salvation, but for concealment. He didn't know it yet, but the subtle, persistent anomalies he would soon begin to document in meticulous detail were not the work of the long dead. They were the mechanical echoes of the long silenced. And he, the humble custodian responsible for the integrity of the structure, was about to discover that the structure itself was the crime. We will begin our deep investigation by analyzing the moment J.W. transitioned from a simple record keeper to an unwilling investigator, a man haunted not by the supernatural, but by the undeniable mathematics of structural failure, a failure he alone seemed able, or perhaps cursed, to perceive. But first, we must breathe the air of 1923. We must understand the foundational instability of the city that demanded this particular kind of calculated, cold silence. The kind of silence that demands a custodian be quietly erased simply because he refuses to stop counting the cost. The cold copper scent lingers. We turn the page, and the vigilance begins. We turn the page from the tactile presence of the attic, the lingering scent of copper and decay that clung to the journal itself, and we must now orient ourselves. The journal of J.W. It did not begin with a ghost. It began, as all proper archives do, with a date, July 14th, 1923. To understand the subsequent entries, the creeping structural dread that would consume J.W., we cannot simply look at the chapel in isolation. We must first understand the city that built it and the peculiar architecture of its injustice. Chicago, 1923. It was not a time of holy reflection. It was a time of ferocious, blinding noise, muffled only by cheap cement and civic apathy. The scars of the Great War were fading, replaced by the frenetic churn of the machine age. The city was a beast of steel and smoke, fueled by ambition and utterly soaked in the liquor of prohibition. The air itself tasted of coal grit and unchecked money. Think of the soundscape J.W. inhabited, the rhythmic clanging of the streetcars on Archer Avenue, the constant low thrum of new construction, the high-pitched whisper of illicit deals passing hands in dimly lit back rooms. This was the height of the syndicates. Al Capone was cementing his empire through violence, yes, but more importantly, through the quiet, meticulous corruption of infrastructure. Every new building, every paving contract, every civic appointment carried the grease of illegal profit. The chapel we are investigating, built in this very period, was not some isolated sanctuary raised by pious donations. It was a piece of the city's vast, compromised mechanism, a physical asset placed strategically in a rapidly growing area, a structure that, in 1923, signaled prestige and stability, while potentially concealing instability beneath its very foundations. J.W., our custodian, was a man of routines. His job in that era was fundamentally thankless: to maintain a structure that was likely built fast and cheap, to fight the eternal battle against the pervasive damp and the persistent noise of Chicago attempting to consume itself. When we read his early entries before the anomalies began, they detail the meticulous work of a man trying to impose order on inherent chaos. He records deliveries of coal, minor repairs to the roof flashing, the replacement of fused light bulbs. But even in these mundane descriptions, there is a subtle anxiety about the physical reality of the chapel. He often mentions the settling. On July 21st, he notes, "The new north wall requires attention again. The plaster cracks run vertical now. They look like veins opening. This building is still moving. It is restless. Restless." In 1923, the city was moving at a pace that disregarded ethical and engineering standards alike. Buildings were erected as monuments to sudden wealth, often compromising long-term integrity for immediate display. The foundation of this chapel, we suspect, was as morally shaky as the city's political foundation. JW saw the chapel not as a house of God, but as a poorly maintained vessel, an oversized, echoey box of brick and wood that was subject to the same pressures that broke the men who walked its streets. The pressure of unforgiving gravity applied to cheap materials, constructed with the intent of rapid completion. We have to consider the nature of injustice in that decade. Injustice wasn't necessarily a dramatic act witnessed in a courthouse. It was baked into the very framework of the city, built into the foundations that cracked, the bridges that failed, and the contracts that vanished. The terror, then, of the Chicago chapel does not originate with some spectral figure demanding repentance, but rather with the persistence of failure, the failure of the engineering, the failure of the architects, the failure of the civic leaders who funded it. JW was an observer of physical systems. He documented what the building was doing, how it was failing, not what it was saying. The structural failure became his terror, because when something built to endure, something designed to inspire reverence, begins to fundamentally betray its purpose, the custodian becomes the uncomfortable witness to the lie. And the great lie of Chicago in 1923 was that stability was guaranteed. It was not. Everything was shaking. The city was simply too big, too fast, too corrupt to be truly stable. This specific chapel, in its position of supposed sanctuary, represented a piece of highly valuable, politically significant real estate. It was, perhaps, designed to be more of a monument to the influence that built it than to any divine entity. It was an infrastructure project. First and foremost, an infrastructure, when corruptly conceived, carries a memory of its own deceit. So when JW first began to notice the anomalies, when he first recorded the inexplicable disturbances that defy logic, he did not attribute them to a spirit, but to a fault. A profound, terrifying structural fault that the city had tried desperately to plaster over. The silence, the peace, the solemnity that a chapel should afford was, in the context of 1923, extremely expensive. JW would soon discover that the silence they bought was not permanent, and the cost of maintaining the lie was far higher than the construction itself. This heavy historical context, this foundation of civic rot, is what makes his very first encounter with the inexplicable so disturbing. It is not the ghost of a dead man. It is the sound of the city's dishonesty, finally echoing back up through the floorboards. It is time to look at his third journal entry, the point where the mundane technical log transforms into a record of paradoxical observation. The moment when JW realized that the problem was not decay, but a deliberate engineered malfunction. Block 3 begins with the sound of the organ, but not the way you might expect. We turn the page now. From the broad panorama of 1923 Chicago, all brass and dust and the low hum of organized vice, we narrow our focus once more, back to the yellowed confinement of JW. His handwritten record, his third entry concerning the structure. It is dated March 16, 1923. The script is still beautifully precise here, demonstrating that careful, almost obsessive neatness characteristic of men whose world is defined by routine maintenance and predictable deterioration. JW was, at this stage, merely cataloging an inconvenience. He was diagnosing a material fault, not describing a spiritual confrontation. He wrote, "I was checking the sanctuary perimeter tonight. The main doors had shifted again, perhaps a quarter inch off plumb. The spring thaw often does this to the north wall. The freeze-thaw cycle is brutal on the expansion joints. It was near 11 o'clock. The temperature was still biting, but the air inside the nave had settled into that specific, cold stillness that only an unheated church can possess." He pauses often in his writing, not due to lack of thought, but due to an abundance of measured detail. JW believed that if he could only log enough data, the anomaly would resolve itself through logic. He then describes the sound. It was not a whisper, it was not a moan, it was the organ. Now, understand the specific context of the chapel's organ. This was not a small electric keyboard. This was a monumental instrument, a great pipe organ, a towering mechanism of wood, brass, and meticulously tuned metal reeds built directly into the west wall of the sanctuary. It was, even in 1923, an antique behemoth, and critically, it was silent. The electricity had been disconnected years earlier, deemed too expensive for regular use. The enormous bellows necessary to push air through the pipes were manually operated and bolted down. The instrument was functionally deaf, a large, beautiful piece of architectural sculpture, awaiting demolition or repair that would likely never come. And yet, J.W. His journal continues, the ink darkening slightly with the weight of the observation. I heard the low, sustained chord first, a dominant pedal point held long and deep. It was not loud, not yet, but unmistakable. It was C minor. I checked the doors again, thinking, of course, that perhaps some mischievous youths had managed to bypass my temporary locking mechanisms and were playing a prank. A silly thought, given the scale of the instrument, but the mind seeks the simplest explanation. The narrator pauses, letting the image settle. A watchman alone in the cold dark, hearing a sound that demands physical exertion. He investigates. He checks the locked doors, the windows, the heavy layered curtains that hid the pipes. He notes the dust on the bench, untouched. The vast, dead console. He puts his hand on the dark mahogany casing. It is cold, inert, and yet the C minor chord persists. I walked the length of the aisle, approaching the instrument slowly. The sound did not diminish, but it did not increase either. It was a fixed volume, steady, like a radio receiving a distant, powerful signal. I leaned in close to the console, placing my ear near the keys. Nothing. The sound was not coming from the wood, or the keys, or the brass stops. This is the turning point in J.W.'s documented sanity. The moment the observed fact defied the material truth. He moves away from the organ itself, confused, turning toward the center of the nave, and there, he finds the source. The sound was not emanating from the instrument. The sound was emanating from the floor. This observation, in the precise, tight handwriting of a man who measured every dimension of his life, is chilling in its clinical absurdity. He was not describing an echo. He was describing a point of origin. J.W. spends the remainder of the entry in obsessive detail, mapping the acoustic anomaly. He begins by believing it is merely a resonance effect. The organ's old, unpressurized pipes acting as resonators for some external city noise, a late freight train perhaps, or distant construction work. Chicago, after all, was always loud, but the chord was pure, sustained. It had the richness and breath of pressurized air, yet there was no airflow. J.W. kneels. He places his hand flat against the oak floorboards, stained dark with age and generations of candle wax. The organ was silent. The floor was vibrating. He records the sensation. It was not a physical shaking, not the gross vibration of a passing subway car. It was subtle, a high-frequency tremble, insistent, pushing up through the wood and the stone. If he lifted his hand a centimeter above the floor, the sound was diffuse, almost gone. When his palm rested upon the surface, the chord resonated perfectly, transferring the frequency directly into his body. He notes that the sound is loudest near the main altar, precisely at the convergence point of the four main foundation pillars. He wrote the key sentence, the one that broke the spell of the classic ghost story and inaugurated a story of architectural dread. The feeling is one of immense, contained pressure. It is not music that I hear exactly, though it possesses the pitch and duration of a sustained note. It is the floor that is singing. The foundation stone is vibrating with the sound of a C minor chord, but there is no music, and there is certainly no musician. The distinction J.W. makes here is vital to understanding the terror of this journal. He is not afraid of the ghostly organist. He is afraid of the materiality of the sound. The fear is not in the supernatural, but in the structural impossibility. If the sound is not coming from the instrument, then the entire building must be acting as the instrument. And if the building is singing a perfectly tuned chord, then what is providing the tremendous constant pressure necessary to sustain that frequency within the sheer weight of the Chicago bedrock? For J.W., the dutiful custodian of infrastructure, this was a seismic shift of perception. The building, his entire world of predictable deterioration and scheduled repair, had become unreliable. It had betrayed the laws of acoustics and physics he relied upon. The chapel was speaking, but its language was pure, unsettling vibration, felt through the soles of his worn leather boots. He concludes the entry with a final, chilling summation that hints at the paranoia that would soon consume him entirely. The sound persists even after I retreated to my quarters. I am lying in bed, 3 flights above the nave, and if I place my ear to the chimney flue or against the thick masonry of the exterior wall, I can still detect the low, deep pulse. It is a drone. a mechanical
chapel doesn't
insistence.
speak in words,
It feels less like an
but in
echo of
tremors.
sound and more like the
A
audible
language of
friction of the
vibration
structure
that
grinding
settles
against
deep
something
in the
immense and
dust.
immovable beneath the soil. It is the sound of the foundation working too hard. The building is not quiet, it is straining. JW had started with a meticulous 3-week inspection of a structural anomaly. By the end of this entry, he understood with a chilling clarity that the chapel was not a place of quiet contemplation. It was a complex acoustic engine, and whatever power was driving its terrifying silent chord, it was housed in the dark, heavy architecture of the earth itself, in the very ground upon which Chicago stood, demanding an investigation that went far deeper than dusty pipework or simple electrical faults, demanding an understanding of engineered dissonance. This is where the archive ceases to be merely historical and becomes intimately, profoundly human. I closed the journal upon the last entry we examined, the one detailing the silent subsonic organ note emanating from the bedrock. The sheer technical precision of JW's
Every
early
echo
documentation,
in this vast
the voltage
space
readings, the
tells a
temperature
story.
differentials, the time-stamped notes on the position of the moon, and the ambient barometric pressure. These pages speak to a man whose greatest comfort lay in the quantifiable, a man who saw chaos and sought to impose order with a fountain pen and a ruler. But as I handled the fragile paper, turning back through the weeks of 1923, the narrative of his decline ceased to be anecdotal and became purely physical. It was legible in the very material of the script. The geography of Stress JW began his log using a disciplined, meticulous copperplate hand. His initial entries hugged the ruled margins of the ledger paper with military precision. The lines are thin, the ink evenly dispersed, the periods are small, deliberate points of finality. He was documenting a job, maintaining a record of infrastructure, a building, a place that housed the faith of others. The change begins subtly, creeping in around the 5th week of the diary. The first sign is the pressure, the sheer, raw force exerted on the nib. Where the early words are laid gently upon the surface, allowing the paper fibers to drink the ink slowly, the later entries are etched. They score the page, leaving a tactile impression, a ghostly echo, on the underside of the subsequent sheet. He was pressing down, harder and harder, as if trying to physically anchor the impossible facts he was recording to the physical reality of the page. This shift is not the sign of a man driven mad by a spectral terror. It is the signature of a man under documented chronic stress. He was fighting the silence, and the fight was wearing out his wrists. The sentences, too, begin to lose their structure. JW transitions from the formal, passive voice of a maintenance report. The secondary conduit was noted to be damp and improperly sealed, to a frantic, immediate, active voice. The noise, the terrible hum, returned precisely at 3:17 a.m. I heard it. I logged it. He starts using shorthand, abbreviations that accelerate the flow of thought, skipping the necessary conjunctions and articles. It is the language of someone who believes time is running out, or perhaps someone who realizes that the very act of documentation is becoming pointless. The true heartbreak is seeing the deterioration of the margins. Initially, every line is level, running parallel to the ruled blue line provided by the printer. But as the anxiety mounts, the handwriting drifts. It angles sharply upward, accelerating towards the top right corner of the page, a clear psychological signifier of rushing, of rising adrenaline, of a mind unable to settle the horizontal balance of observation. He was losing his grip on the foundation, and that instability was manifesting directly onto the paper he held. The weight of testimony. We often imagine the terror of haunting as a confrontation, a ghostly scream, a sudden chill, a figure in the dark. JW's terror was far quieter, far more institutional. His fear was not that he was being hunted, but that he was being deliberately, utterly ignored. Imagine the profound isolation of that chapel in 1923. He is the custodian. He is the only one present to witness the undeniable, measurable anomalies, the failing relays, the unauthorized acoustics, the foundational instability. He documents them with precision, expecting the board, the city, the engineers to respond to evidence. But they do not. He keeps writing. He sends notes. He records the dates of the non-responses. He logs the specific times the letters were mailed. His terror is the slow, dawning realization that the system he trusts, the civic structure built on facts and reports, has no mechanism to process a truth that contradicts its own convenient narrative. If a maintenance man documents a structural impossibility in a decommissioned church in Chicago, and no one reads the report. Did the impossibility ever happen? J.W. was suffering from what I call documentation fatigue. He wasn't afraid of the anomaly itself. He was afraid of the relentless, exhausting burden of being the sole keeper of an unacceptable truth. He became suspicious not just of the building, but of the silence outside the building. I found one entry, scrawled almost vertically across the page in ink so thick it had cracked the paper slightly as it dried, dated late October. I spoke to Mr. Thomas at the precinct. He said I was drinking again, but I haven't touched the rot gut since 1918. I told him about the floor, how it shakes independent of the surface wind. He said to stop worrying about the structure and worry about the collection. The implication is chilling. JW was being preemptively discredited. The authorities, the local community structure, were already constructing a narrative for his inevitable decline. A drunk, a madman, a man hallucinating structural issues where there were none. He wasn't fighting a ghost. He was fighting the vast, concrete indifference of the city of Chicago itself. The knowledge that the truth would die with him, that his measured, documented reality would be erased by a bureaucratic footnote citing maintenance man instability. This is the pressure that physically broke the man long before any spirit might have touched him. And this psychological burden, this profound need to find an external explanation for the systemic silencing, is what led JW to the most cliché, the most conventional horror narrative available to him. If the engineers wouldn't listen to his facts, perhaps a ghost story would give his truth the voice it desperately needed. He was done documenting the foundation. He was done logging the frequencies. His next desperate move was to climb high toward the shadows and the legend, searching for an answer in the obvious darkness, an answer that, crucially, was entirely wrong. He was going to look for the priest, when the one they said had hanged himself in the bell tower 20 years before. An entry, slightly tear-stained, marked only with a frantic scribble of the date, sets the stage for his retreat into superstition. If the living will not acknowledge the facts I present, then perhaps the dead are more honest with their presence. And so, J.W., the meticulous engineer of the Foundation, abandoned his instruments and turned his weary eyes toward the Campanile, the ultimate red herring in a mystery far more complex than any conventional haunting. We must follow him up those rotting stairs, into the dizzying height where the only sound is the wind and the promise of a false answer. We return now to the frantic documentation of J.W., the custodian, moving past the detailed script of his psychological unraveling. The journal entries begin to lose their initial meticulous structure by late November 1923. The meticulous script that detailed the proper cleaning compounds for the marble choir stalls is replaced by a desperate, almost illegible hand scrawling across the cheap, acid-rich paper. J.W. was no longer investigating an anomaly. He was hunting for a resolution. He needed a name for the thing that was shaking his foundations. And so, he landed upon the most convenient, most easily dismissed, and yet most human explanation available to him. He found the red herring. The chapel, like any old place in a big city, carried its legends. Small, whispered narratives passed between generations of parishioners and staff. One such narrative centered on the tragic end of a deacon, a man named Thomas, who, decades earlier, had succumbed to an unspoken shame, or perhaps simple, crushing loneliness, and chosen to end his life within the echoing vastness of the bell tower, J.W. His journal entry number 12, penned in a midnight rush, shows a sudden sharp clarity amidst the chaos. They say the silence is unnatural up there, where Thomas took his rest. They say sometimes you can feel the pressure of his passing in the wood. I have been listening for the vibrations beneath me, in the stones, in the iron grates of the crypt. But if the noise is a complaint, then perhaps I have been listening in the wrong direction. This was the shift. The attempt to transform the abstract engineering phenomenon into the comforting familiarity of a standard haunting. If the phenomenon was a ghost, he could understand it. If it was a ghost, it had motives, emotions, and boundaries. If it was a ghost, he could potentially appease it. And so, J.W. gathered his courage and prepared for a long vigil. He left the boiler room, the source of the terrible ground-level hum, and began the long ascent. The bell tower of St. Jude's was a forgotten skeletal spire of old-growth oak and rust, a space utterly unlike the polished piety of the nave below. The air grew immediately colder as he climbed the narrow, tightly wound staircase. Each step was a petition to the structure itself, groaning beneath his weight. Upward, through the gloom, past the levels of dark, dormant machinery. The mechanism that controlled the striking of the hours, heavy iron gears, thick hemp ropes, was silent, locked in time. He carried only a small, unreliable oil lantern. The light cast long, dancing shadows, making the massive, suspended brass bell appear as a bruised, silent giant above him. He secured the trap door behind him. He was completely isolated. The world of 1923 Chicago, the roaring trucks, the distant music of the speakeasies, the rumble of the elevated train, all were muffled, reduced to a low, uniform, urban static far beneath his feet. J.W. settled himself on a low, dusty wooden bench directly beneath the gargantuan curve of the bell. The smell here was heavy and mineral. Old dust, the dry droppings of pigeons, and the metallic tang of oxidized copper and iron. He waited. Hours passed. The lantern flickered, demanding his attention, forcing him to trim the wick. He watched the movement of the thick supporting beams, tracing the wood grain with his weary eyes. He listened not just for sound, but for the absence of sound. That profound, sucking quiet, they said, accompanied the lost. He wrote briefly in his journal, "The cold is aggressive here. I can feel the wind searching for gaps in the mortar, but I hear nothing but the wind itself. I have asked for a sign, for a sound, for the evidence of Thomas." He was searching for the theatrical moment, the dramatic chill, the spectral figure, the mournful cry. He was searching for the conventional horror story he had read, the easy explanation that would permit him to sleep again. But the tower provided nothing of the sort. The silence of the belfry was not the absence of sound, but a vast, suffocating presence of expectation. An expectation, left unfilled, becomes its own kind of terror. As the pre-dawn hours approached, the time when, tradition dictates, the veil between worlds thins to tissue, J.W. felt nothing supernatural. He only felt the overwhelming weight of the material world. He heard the squeak of the bell's yoke shifting microscopically in the cold air. He heard his own shallow, frozen breath. He began to realize the dreadful truth. The tower was simply architecture. It was wood and metal, subjected only to gravity and wind pressure. It was hollow. The realization hit him with the force of genuine panic. The noise he had been hearing in the chapel foundations, the aggressive, insistent, low-frequency hum that vibrated through the limestone, was structurally opposed to the silence of the tower. The sound downstairs was dense. It was material. It was the feeling of being pressed, weighted, crushed. The sound up here was merely the sound of being abandoned. J.W. wrote a final defeated line before descending. "Thomas is not here. Whatever complaint is echoing through this structure, it is not the complaint of a ghost. It is the sound of the foundation failing. And I have wasted a night searching for a shadow when I should have been looking for the truth beneath the floorboards." The red herring had failed. The search for the classic, conventional ghost had led him only to a deeper, more unsettling vacuum. The architecture had frustrated his pursuit of the spiritual, forcing him back toward the material, investigative realm. This pivot, this decisive failure in the bell tower, was crucial. It eliminated the easy answer and drove J.W. toward the frightening conclusion that the terror was not divine or supernatural, but fundamentally, horrifyingly, human. He climbed down from the cold height as the first light of dawn struggled over the Chicago skyline. He did not feel relief. He felt profound fatigue and a renewed sense of paranoia. The structure had failed to produce a ghost, which meant the anomaly was not an inhabitant of the structure, but a function of it. This shift in perspective meant the next investigation would be far more dangerous. If the sound was not a spirit, it must be engineering. And if it was engineering, it had been placed there deliberately. The descent from the tower took him back toward the boiler room, back toward the stone stairs leading down to the deep maintenance tunnels and storage areas below the foundations. J.W. was no longer seeking a legend. He was seeking a blueprint. The true nature of the chapel was about to be revealed, not through whispers of the dead, but through the cold, hard logic of concrete and steel, a secret buried not by time, but by design. And what he found next, chronicled in the 18th and 19th entries of his journal, was the realization that the chapel was not built to house the faithful, but to mask something utterly antithetical to faith itself. We must return to the structural analysis of the foundations and the horrifying implication of the chapel's construction. J.W. was about to connect the dissonant sound to the very physics of the building. and what he documented would fundamentally change our understanding of how silence is engineered. The journal entries of J.W. following the failed vigil in the belfry shift dramatically. It is as if the disappointment of confronting the textbook ghost scenario, the enraptured specter of the former priest, and finding absolutely nothing, purged the supernatural lens from his eyes.
Incredible.
He stopped looking up.
Craftsmanship.
He started looking
The sheer
down.
age of this
He returned to
place.
the structure itself,
It
demanding
changes
empirical
everything.
proof. He treated the unsettling vibration, that persistent subterranean hum he called the choir of stone, not as an act of haunting, but as a failure of engineering, a structural dissonance that he, the custodian, was obligated to document and resolve. And here, in entry 19, begins the slow, terrifying descent into a truly unique form of paranoia. The paranoia rooted not in shadows, but in geometry. J.W. His handwriting, which had been frantic and panicked during the belfry incident, now becomes excruciatingly precise. He begins drawing, not sketches of spectral figures or warped faces, but schematics, cross-sections, measured distances annotated in neat dark ink. He uses his tools, the tools of a man employed to maintain a building, a plummet, a tape measure, a spirit level, and he begins testing the impossible uniformity of the structure. He spent 4 days, by his own account, meticulously mapping the width of the walls at the foundation level. The material was limestone, standard for the era, but the sheer bulk, he noted, was extraordinary. He writes, "They are too thick, much too thick. This is not the wall of a chapel built for humble congregation. This is the wall of a vault, meant to keep something out, or perhaps to keep something in." He compares the measurements of the main nave walls to the choir stall walls, finding a consistent, mathematically perfect ratio of thickness to height. He describes the deliberate, almost obsessive precision of the construction. It was built with a specific acoustic purpose in mind. But the purpose was not to enhance the sermon. The profound horror of J.W.'s discovery is not that the chapel is haunted, but that the chapel was designed to be silence itself. He documents his realization through a painful, incremental process of logical deduction. He revisits the persistent problem of the organ playing itself, the vibration that resonated through the floor. He had initially assumed the vibration was the source of the sound, perhaps the building's own weary bones crying out. He was wrong. J.W. hypothesizes and later insists that the chapel was constructed not as a sacred space, but as a colossal architectural device engineered for Kyric counter-frequency. He theorizes that the immense thickness of the walls, the unusual depth of the footings, and even the calculated placement of the massive stone buttresses along the north side created a specific kind of physical ballast. This building, this supposed sanctuary of faith, was built to absorb, redirect, and utterly deaden a consistent sound frequency emanating from deep underground. "It is a box," he scribbles in the margin, the pen tip digging shallow grooves into the aging paper. A heavy, magnificent, deadening box. It was built to mask. Think for a moment about that realization. If you are haunted by a whisper, you search for the speaker. If you are haunted by the echo of music, you seek the source of the instrument. But J.W. realized that the chapel was singing its own low, perpetual song, the hum that had driven him to distraction, only because it was battling another, older, louder sound. The foundation was structured to capture and neutralize certain vibrations. The persistent low hum he heard was the effort of the building attempting to do its job. It was the sound of the silence failing. And this changes everything about his perception of the architecture. The space is no longer holy. It is a crime scene camouflaged in stone and stained glass. In entry 21, dated late November 1923, J.W. details the moment of absolute, chilling certainty. He used an old carpenter's listening horn, a primitive form of amplification, to press against the floor in the absolute center of the altar. The resonance there was always loudest, but this time, he wasn't listening for the organ. He was listening through the organ's effect. He describes a rapid, percussive sound, muffled and dull but rhythmic. A sound that had been perfectly, clinically filtered out by the tons of limestone above it. He writes that the sound was akin to a dull, ceaseless striking. A sound that required repeated, heavy, mechanical effort. Not the whisper of a ghost, nor the sigh of a broken boiler pipe. It was the sound of activity, calculated, consistent, and deeply hidden. He knew then that the silence of the chapel was not the stillness of reverence. It was the heavy blanket of intentional human deceit. The entire structure, built in an era rife with clandestine dealings and subterranean secrets in Chicago, was not a beacon of light, but a strategic piece of acoustic suppression. The terrifying conclusion he reaches is that the architect of this building was not concerned with God, but with secrecy. J.W., the weary custodian, had stopped chasing shadows. He was now facing down architecture as an instrument of malice. He realized that the foundation of the chapel, the very bedrock of his employment, was resting upon something entirely profane, something that required constant, massive effort to keep from spilling into the light. He records a single, shattering line that marks the turning point from fear to focused, grim determination. The ghost is not what is beneath the floor. The ghost is the man who paid for the floor to be so quiet. This revelation, born from detailed measurements and pure architectural analysis, immediately changes J.W.'s mission. He stops documenting the sounds of the haunting. He starts documenting the proof of the concealment. He needed to find out what crime, what hidden operation, what historical injustice required this monstrous, calculated silence. And as the narrative moves forward, we see J.W. turn from a documentarian of the strange to a full-fledged investigator, shifting his focus entirely from the physical manifestations of sound to the paper trail of the architectural plan, seeking the human hand behind the structural evil. The psychological burden must have been immense. To realize that the entire sacred space was, in fact, an enormous tool of corruption, meant to serve as a high-frequency mask for something unspeakable below. The terror of that knowledge outweighs any spectral encounter. He now stands at the precipice of true historical discovery, armed only with his journal, his exhausted resolve, and the bitter knowledge that the truth is often found in the thickness of a wall, not the thinness of a veil. And it is this meticulous, agonizing search for the blueprints, the evidence of the conspiracy, that leads him to the final hidden compartment of his own journal, where the real documents were stashed away for decades, waiting for the day the building finally failed to silence the truth. It was Block 6, you will recall, where J.W. had finally moved past the conventional terror, past the fruitless search for the hanged cleric in the bell tower, past the assumption of a haunted relic. His terror had solidified into a cold, hard fact. The chapel was engineered. It was a machine for acoustic dampening. But why? The journal itself offered the answer, hidden not within the frantic script of the final pages, but within the very structure of the book. I had spent weeks, you see, meticulously documenting the journal's physical deterioration. I handled it with gloves, noting the chemical burn marks on the pages, the water stains that mapped its long residence in that damp Chicago attic. It was during this conservation process, smoothing down a stubbornly warped back cover, that I noticed a discontinuity. The cardboard backing felt thick, too thick. The paperboard used for the cover in 1923 was cheap single-ply material. Here, the material separating the external binding cloth from the internal pasted-down end paper had a subtle, hollow give, a slight rattle. It was deliberate. J.W. hadn't merely written his fears. He had created a contingency archive. Carefully, using a thin spatula designed for archival separation, I lifted the corner of the heavy linen end paper. It peeled away with a dry, dusty whisper, revealing not the expected glue and board, but a deeply cut cavity. A pocket carved into the very architecture of the journal. Within that brittle hollow, folded and secured with a length of degraded twine, the kind used for shipping tags, lay the documents. They were not letters of farewell or confessions of faith. They were technical drawings and codes. The air in the library where I worked suddenly felt far colder than the ambient temperature. This was the moment of transfer, the instant J.W.'s physical evidence moved across the decades, landing cold and heavy in my contemporary hands. The first document was brittle, thin tracing paper, darkened at the edges by age, covered in the faded blue lines of architectural drafting. They were foundation plans. These were not the official records I had cross-referenced in the city archives, the public-facing blueprints that showed a standard Midwestern chapel basement, shallow and utilitarian. These plans showed depth, and they showed intention. They detailed a secondary sublevel, a feature that did not exist on the sanctioned maps. This sublevel wasn't a cellar. It was an insulated cavity, marked with astonishing detail. The walls were disproportionately thick, specified with layers of dense shale and mortar, designed not just for structural integrity, but for absorption. A dedicated access shaft, discreetly hidden beneath the choir loft's main staircase, descended into darkness. The measurements were meticulous, almost maniacal. Every calculation J.W. had made in the journal about sound abatement, the frequency ratios, the thickness of the stone, was merely him retro-engineering the mechanism described in these blueprints. The terror was architectural. If the sound frequency of the organ, as J.W. noted earlier, was designed to vibrate the foundations, those vibrations were a carefully calibrated counter frequency. They were meant to counteract, to cancel out, the specific lower frequency sounds of what was happening below. The second set of documents provided the what. They were flimsy pieces of official letterhead, stamped with the insignia of a long-defunct Chicago infrastructure company, a shell corporation that the historical record links directly to Prohibition-era racketeering. The paper itself was an artifact of civic corruption. These weren't formal business letters. They were concise, almost curt exchanges, scrawled in fast, looping ink, punctuated by numbers and initials that read like ciphers. R11 completion set for 14/11/23. Ensure full abatement protocols active during the transfer phase. The frequency lock must hold until the inventory is sealed. CA demands silence. CA. These communications, once decrypted by cross-referencing names found in JW's marginalia, and later by consulting historians specializing in the period, were not discussing liturgical schedules or organ maintenance. They were discussing logistics. They were discussing sealing. J.W., in his naive role as caretaker, had inadvertently witnessed the commissioning and execution of a massive engineering project designed to facilitate and hide criminal activity directly beneath a consecrated space. The chapel wasn't built for worship. It was built for the cover. In 1923 Chicago, silence was the most expensive commodity. A building designed to acoustically isolate a significant subterranean operation, be it a massive bootlegging storage vault, a secret entry point to the city's vast tunnel networks, or a site for the coercive handling of rival informants, was worth far more than its listed value as a house of God. The terrifying singing foundation J.W. kept hearing, that vibration that drove him to document every detail, was not the echo of a dead priest. It was the residual frequency of massive construction work, hidden and hurried. It was the sound of the operation itself, the shovels, the carts, the low thrum of pumps moving illicit material, the muffled voices of men working under absolute secrecy, the sound of the original crime. JW's job was not to sweep the aisles. His job was to be the unwitting, official human testimony that nothing was wrong. But JW was a keeper of records. He was meticulous. He was a scientist of silence. And once he realized that the silence he was employed to maintain was a deliberate, engineered lie, his purpose shifted. He stopped being the janitor. He became the archivist of the victims, the quiet corruption and the loud injustice that the structure was meant to bury. The weight of the materials in my hand was immense. It was the weight of a century of institutional deceit. JW hadn't gone mad seeing ghosts. He had gone mad realizing that his entire reality was a stage set, paid for by criminals, designed to resonate with a frequency that nullified the sound of their deeds. The chilling culmination of this discovery, what truly defines the persistent horror of this story, is the realization that the chapel was designed to protect the corruption. The structure was supposed to hold the truth down, ensuring that no one, least of all the humble janitor, could ever hear the foundational facts vibrating beneath their feet. And yet, JW heard it. And now, armed with the evidence he risked everything to preserve, I was hearing it too. The silence had finally been broken. We return now to the pocket of revelation. That brittle, copper-stained parchment, folded tight within the journal's back flap. It was not merely a collection of documents. It was JW's ultimate, desperate declaration. He had spent months documenting the impossible, the acoustic anomaly, the suspicious structural engineering, and the architectural lie that was this entire chapel. Now, in the final, frantic entries of his logbook, he detailed his planned final act. JW, the meticulous custodian, believed that if he could not defeat the silence with his own voice, he could do so with unassailable material proof. The handwriting in the last 4 entries shifts entirely. Gone is the precise, controlled script of the former railway clerk, replaced by a jagged, pressurized scrawl that looks less like ink on paper and more like a seismograph reading of a collapsing mind. He wrote of contacting 2 specific newspapers, the Chicago Daily News, and later, the larger, more imposing Tribune. He detailed the sheer weight of his evidence, the blueprints annotated with his frantic circular notes, and the ciphered correspondence that spelled out logistics rather than liturgy. I presented the plans to the young man, J.W. wrote on a Tuesday morning, the ink smeared as if by rain or tears. He looked at the acoustic calculations first. He looked at me last. He asked if I'd been drinking the river water. I told him the structure was drinking the city's lies.
Behind the altar.
He said his editor deals with facts, not fever dreams from old men. The system was designed, as it so often is, to ignore the inconvenient truth offered by the invisible man. J.W.'s struggle was now not against an unknown spectral force, but against the suffocating power of civic disbelief. He was watching his reality, a reality based on cold, hard geometry and the sound of vibrations, be dissolved by ridicule. The following entry is shorter, chillingly devoid of punctuation. The second attempt was worse. They did not laugh. They simply said that certain elements of the city's infrastructure were not open to public scrutiny, and that perhaps I should consider retirement and silence. That is what they said, silence. And then, the final harrowing entry, undated, merely positioned after a blank, trembling page. I left the packet on the steps, by the gargoyle that watches the lake. Perhaps the stone will hold it better than I could. I heard the foundation singing, but it was not the song of prayer. It was the sound of earth moving against itself, trying to cough up what was buried. That was it. The journal ends there. J.W. Wetherell, the custodian who became a truth-teller, vanishes from the historical record shortly thereafter. He did not quit his job. He did not collect a pension. He simply ceased to register with the world. The crime of this specific place was not the death of the sexton. The red herring, J.W., had initially chased in the bell tower, but the effective murder of J.W.'s credibility. The great crime, however, was what they were trying to hide below. It is in the ciphered correspondences, which I eventually decoded, using the simple frequency shift J.W. had scribbled in the margin, that the truth of the chapel's function emerged. The Capella de San Miguel Arcanjo, built quickly and cheaply with highly suspect, politically tied funding in the early 1920s, was never primarily intended as a house of worship. It was designed as an acoustic buffer for a massive subterranean logistical hub. Chicago in 1923 was a city choked by prohibition. The demand for illicit alcohol, weapons, and contraband was met by sprawling interconnected tunnels, often old sewer or maintenance lines, that ran beneath the city's surface. The blueprints, cross-referenced with J.W.'s notes, proved this with chilling precision. Directly beneath the chapel's foundation, accessed via a sealed and reinforced crawl space that J.W. had never been able to breach, was a newly constructed, reinforced tunnel system. This was not a small storage room. It was a primary distribution point. The low, resonant frequency that J.W. detected in the foundations, the sound he mistook for the organ, or a ghost, or the despair of the bell tower, was the constant, heavy, pragmatic noise of organized crime in operation. Think of the sound, not of a spirit, but of men working tirelessly underground. The scraping of crates being moved across rough concrete floors, the dull thud of heavy boots on the damp earth, the muffled low roar of combustion engines or generators used to move product or pump air. Perhaps even the quiet, urgent conversation of men conducting transactions deep beneath the water table. The architects, working for the criminal entities, likely tied to the local political machine protecting the syndicates, knew that this constant industrial vibration would be noticeable above ground, particularly in the quiet hours. It would betray the operation. Therefore, they engineered the chapel's specific foundation, the oddly constructed piers, the unusual density of the floor plating, to generate a specific counter-frequency, a low, persistent, stabilizing hum, the anti-sound designed to mask the subterranean activity. When J.W. started hearing the singing of the foundation, it was not the mechanism working, it was the mechanism failing. As the materials aged, as the weather shifted, and as the structural integrity began to wane after perhaps only 2 decades, the dampening frequency began to waver. Instead of canceling out the sound, the architecture began to amplify the vibration, distorting the noise into something unsettling and mechanical. The terror JW faced was the physical manifestation of institutional corruption. He wasn't haunted by the dead. He was haunted by the ceaseless ongoing work of the wicked, vibrating through the stone. My discovery, nearly 70 years later, did more than just explain the haunting. It provided the ultimate vindication for J.W. Wetherell. The terror that broke his mind was not fantasy. It was fact. He was not mad. He was meticulously, perfectly correct. He was a man with a low, constant frequency of truth, attempting to break through the engineered silence of a massive, profitable lie. The disappearance of J.W. serves as the final, brutal punctuation mark. When he attempted to surface the truth, the powerful figures who funded the anti-sound architecture simply ensured he became part of the silence they engineered. He was swallowed by the system the chapel was designed to protect. But the beautiful, terrible irony of physical architecture is this: stone remembers. The foundational tremor, the low, persistent, vibrating moan I recorded in that dust-choked chapel in 1993, was not merely a structural fault. It was the persistence of JW's truth. A sound so deeply rooted in the materials that even decades after the Prohibition tunnels were filled or abandoned, the stone continued to resonate with the memory of the crime. The architecture could not contain the truth forever. It could only postpone its arrival. And so, the vigil of J.W. Wetherell, the custodian of the chapel's secret, becomes my own. His final wish, that the packet left on the gargoyle steps might eventually be seen, has, through the slow, methodical work of archaeology and transcription, finally been fulfilled. The real haunting of Chicago, of that decommissioned chapel, is not an echo of despair. It is the stubborn physical refusal of the infrastructure to let the historical crime remain silent. It is the victory of the material truth over the architectural lie, and it finally gives voice to the man who was erased. Because he heard too clearly what the city tried to bury. We are left standing at the threshold of the known world and the architecture of complicity. The documents, retrieved from the hidden pocket of JW, his diary, the ciphered letters, the engineering diagrams marked with unusual acoustic specifications, the clipped newspaper articles detailing unexplained disappearances in the immediate vicinity of the chapel in 1924. All of it confirmed the cold, hard geometry of the horror. The chapel was not simply haunted by a lingering spirit. It was a functioning mechanism, a piece of civic infrastructure designed to perpetuate a silence. I secured the last remnants of the investigation. The diary, carefully wrapped in archival tissue, lay beside the bundled blueprints. The copper tang had faded slightly, perhaps replaced now by the dry scent of certainty. I walked the circumference of the main hall one last time. The space, once oppressive, now felt merely hollowed out. The great organ recess, where JW had first heard the non-sound, the vibrational hum that bypassed the ears and settled directly in the sternum, that recess was just wood and dust now. I retrieved a small laminated card from my pack, not a cross nor a prayer card, but a plain white square with a single handwritten note on it, sealed against the elements. A tiny, defiant act of witnessing. I tucked it into the highest corner of the organ recess, hidden from casual sight, but placed precisely where JW would have brushed past it during his rounds. The note simply read, "Uvido, escutado, lembrado." Heard, listened to, remembered. It was a small acknowledgement against the tidal wave of deliberate oblivion that the entire structure represented. It was the only epitaph I could offer the forgotten victims, and to the keeper who paid the ultimate price for his meticulous documentation. JW's ultimate failure was not a failure of courage, but a failure of communication. He had evidence, undeniable facts documented with the precise, methodical hand of a custodian obsessed with order. But when he tried to take those facts to the outside world, to the newspapers, to the police, perhaps even to the rival syndicates he hoped might utilize the information, he was swallowed by the same silence the building was engineered to enforce. His final entry, written in a hand that had dissolved entirely from neat script into frantic, jagged slashes, spoke not of fear of death, but of the despair of being rendered irrelevant. They won't read it. They say my mind is tired. They say the city is loud enough as it is. They say they will take care of me. I know what that means. I only pray someone, someday, hears the foundation singing the truth before they let it fall to dust. J.W. did not die of fright. He died because his truth was inconvenient to the powerful architecture of Chicago in 1924. The tragedy of this chapel, the true nature of its haunting, is the persistent echo of that administrative injustice. The victims buried beneath the floor, their remains or their evidence sequestered in the meticulously constructed subtunnels, they were silenced by steel and sound engineering. J.W. was silenced by the indifference of the system he tried to warn. And now, a century later, the materials, the journal, the plans, the residual resonance finally speak. The terror is not the sudden shock of a spectral presence, but the slow, sinking horror that such calculated cruelty can be built into the very bones of a structure, standing unchallenged for generations. I stepped out of the chapel and closed the heavy iron-bound doors behind me. The latching mechanism echoed with a metallic finality. The building stood, outwardly serene, another forgotten historical marker in a quickly gentrifying neighborhood, but I knew what it was. A monument to a crime, a coffin built of acoustic density, the memory of the low, ceaseless thrum J.W. described, that frequency engineered to mask the sounds of human activity below ground, the counting, the binding, the drilling, the desperate muffled pleas. That frequency now sits in the quiet recesses of my own analytical mind. I have carried the silence of the abandoned church and the noise of the buried truth back into the light. The architecture of silence is vast, persistent, and often deeply embedded in the structures of our daily lives. These forgotten records, these discarded journals, these hidden archives, they are the cracks through which the suppressed resonance must escape. Our mission here, the enduring commitment of Midnight Hauntings, is simply to listen where others have chosen to ignore. It is to perform the slow, painstaking labor of the vigil. We must accept that the investigation into true historical terror is rarely instantaneous or sensational. It is often mundane, relying on faded ink, degraded paper, and the unwavering conviction that documentation is the most potent form of exorcism. The story of J.W. is a necessary reminder. He was a meticulous man who became a lonely, terrified archivist, believing deeply that if only the facts were organized, if only the measurements were precise, the truth would hold its own weight. He failed in his time, but his failure was not final. It was merely paused, waiting for someone to finish the reading. I have finished the reading. The chapel still stands, but its purpose is now inverted. No longer a tool of suppression, it is a testament to the fact that no silence, however well engineered, is permanent. This is the nature of the haunting we pursue. Not the brief chill of a passing phantom, but the heavy, systemic chill of truths intentionally frozen in time. If you understand this depth, if you recognize that the most profound terror is rooted not in the imagination, but in documented injustice, if you believe these silenced histories deserve our meticulous investigative attention, and that the long vigil against deliberate forgetfulness must be maintained, then I invite you to join our mission. Support the work of Midnight Hauntings. Support the long, slow process of gathering evidence, securing these fragile archives, and giving voice to the keepers and the victims who were buried beneath the noise of the past. We must ensure that the sacrifice of J.W. and the suffering of those silenced by the architecture of Chicago's darkest years, that none of it was in vain. The darkness only persists where no light is cast upon the documentation. Our light is slow, deliberate, often heavy with shadow, but it is unwavering. The investigation ends here, but the vigil continues.